Hey, time to talk about the circulatory system, one of my favorites. So the structure and function of the circulatory system includes blood and lymph that moves through the body, keeps both the blood and the lymph tissues help to maintain homeostasis and help with our immunity. So I'm all about the homeostasis and immunity. You've heard me talk about it a lot this year, and we're just getting going. Usually the body has 4 to 5 liters of blood. About 8% of your body weight is made up from blood. Again, your blood transports nutrients, oxygen, hormones, removes waste, carbon dioxide, helps to provide immunities by letting your antibodies flow through your system, and maintains your body temperature, your electrolytes, and God forbid if you're ever cut, it helps to clot a wound, helps prevent the bleeding. So let's talk about red blood cells or erythrocytes first. They all contain a protein called hemoglobin, and that oxygen binds with the hemoglobin and goes through all your cells, and the carbon dioxide is removed and the oxygen replaces it as part of our circulation. Each red blood cell lives 90 to 120 days, so they're pretty hardy. New cells are manufactured by red bone marrow, which is found in a lot of the long bones and flat bones or other myeloid tissues in the bone. White blood cells, or leukocytes, help to remove foreign particles. They fight infection. They help to prevent your disease. There's fewer white blood cells than red blood cells. And white blood cells are larger than the red blood cells. These leukocytes only live for about 90 days. When there's ever an infection, you've actually probably seen white blood cells in the form of pus. That's what pus is a collection of white blood cells that kind of go to an area that's been compromised to help fight infection. There's 5 types of white blood cells, and these are just a picture of what they look like. I'm not going to ask you the specifics for each of these, but just recognize that neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes are all names of different types of white blood cells. Platelets, the thrombocytes, are the smallest blood cells. Platelets promote clotting and help prevent blood loss. They can form a plug that seals a small vessel by themselves or start the clotting process. They're produced in the bone marrow and they live 5 to 9 days. Plasma is that pale yellow liquid that is the rest of the blood component. If you were to spin out all the cells, you'd be left with about 55% of what constitutes blood, and that's plasma. 90% of that's water and 10% of plasma is protein. It contains nutrients, electrolytes, oxygen, enzymes, hormones, and also waste products, and it helps to fight infection and also assists in the clotting of blood. It's the fluid portion of the blood. For blood typing, you guys had a little taste of this when you went to the lab. A person's blood is inherited. Blood types determined by an antigen located on the surface of the red blood cell. Clumping of incompatible cells blocks blood vessels and can cause death. There's 4 main blood types, A, B, AB, and O. AB is the universal recipient and O is the universal donor. And here's just another little makeup of what markers are on there. You just need to know that there's those 4 blood types. And most people are either A positive or O positive. And then a very small percent of the population are these other types. Lymph and lymphatic tissue. Lymphatic tissue helps with our immunity. It maintains the body's fluid balance. When the lymph is damaged from any kind of physical injury, the tissue that lies beneath sometimes that'll result in fluid leaking out into the body and causing kind of a permanent swelling of that area. Lymph is a watery substance formed from fluid that filters into the body tissue or interstitially, as they call it, within the tissue. And lymphatic tissue consists of, examples are the tonsils, the thymus gland, the spleen, the nodes, and lymph vessels. If you don't know if you've ever reached around and felt the back of your neck when you didn't feel good and you feel little marbly things there, that's lymph tissue trying to prevent an infection from traveling to the rest of your body. And so here's the different glands and ducts, and the lymph kind of is like a lace that kind of is over your whole body. But you can see all those little lymph nodes, and when you don't feel good, that's what you feel, those little nodules in your neck. Sorry, I had to answer the phone. So anyway, there's some lymph tissue, and you feel that when you don't feel well. You can kind of poke around and feel those little nodules growing. So about immunity. Immunity is an immune response. It takes two different forms. First, the barrier of the skin, mucous membrane, tears, and leukocytes. Those are all ways that keep you from getting infections. And then leukocytes. Inside the leukocytes are antibodies that are formed in response to the antigens or foreign materials in the body. So your body will build up those antibodies. You can have a localized or a systemic reaction to any kind of invasion. And you can also have immunity that you inherited, or you can acquire it through vaccines and that kind of thing. Let's see. Let's talk about some assessment techniques. Your hemoglobin is a test to measure the amount of oxygen carrying ability that the blood has. Your hemoglobin is kind of your iron content. Your hematocrit measures the volume of the number of red blood cells in your blood. It's another way of testing whether or not you're anemic. The sedimentation rate measures how long it takes for all the junk in your blood, the erythrocytes in particular, to settle to the bottom of a container. And the higher the sedimentation rate, the more clogged your vessels are with that, blood. So there's a certain ideal level you want to get to. And the reticulocyte measures the number of immature red blood cells if you have reticulocyte counts. And sometimes people are lethargic and tired and they don't know why. Their reticulocyte and their sedimentation rate might be low because their red blood count's off. Because red blood cells carry oxygen and give you energy. Why are male muscles typically larger than female muscles? Because men have more red blood cells in their body, therefore they have more oxygen taken to the tissues, therefore the tissues grow bigger. So that's why men get more muscular than women. That's why we check for anemia, the hemoglobin, the hematocrit, the sed rate, the reticulocyte study. We want to see if there's a good amount or enough red blood cells to keep the oxygen count high in the body. Then there's the RBC, or the red blood count, that actually determines the number of red blood cells. Platelets or thrombocyte counts. Remember, platelets and thrombocytes are the same thing. They're the clotting factor in your blood. And so you want to make sure you have enough platelet count. If you didn't have enough platelet count and there wasn't clotting, you could bump into a table and get a giant bruise with just a little knock of it, because it would be an indication there wasn't enough platelets. There's actually a condition called thrombocytopenia, which means that there's a lack of platelets or thrombocytes. And if they don't know what it's caused from, it's called idiopathic thrombocytopenia. So nobody would want that diagnosis. It would simply mean you didn't have enough clotting factor and you could bleed. So if you were playing a contact sport and you had thrombocytopenia and somebody, gave you a headbutt, you could bleed to death from it. So that's, when people have unexplained bruising, or bleeding that takes so long to clot that there's a question, you'd want to have the platelets counted. And then you can have the ABCs done, which we actually extract bone marrow from the crest of the hip, or sometimes the sternum as well. And you get to see that at the bedside in the hospital. It's pretty cool to see if you get to see it. But they go in with a really large bore needle and just grind it into the bone and withdraw some of that bone marrow, so they can really study the red blood cell production. It's kind of cool, except it sounds like you're grinding into bone. It makes people a little nauseous. So here's some disorders. Acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, aka AIDS, dysfunction of that immune system caused by the AIDS virus. An allergy is a hypersensitivity. It's an immune response to some kind of attack on the system. And then anemia, when the blood doesn't have enough hemoglobin or red blood cells. An autoimmune disorder is a condition where the immune system of the body turns against itself, and there's several of them. I actually have 5 autoimmune diseases that tend to group together. So that's just an example. Like the vitiligo I have is an autoimmune disease where my body has turned against itself and destroyed its own pigment. Elephantitis is a massive accumulation of lymph tissue fluids. And so all of a sudden you'll have a foot that's like 6 times bigger than it should, because there's been lymphatic damage and the tissues have leaked out, the fluid has leaked out of the cells and into the tissue. And then erythroblastosis fetalis is the condition of the unborn baby where the mother forms antibodies against the antigens of the baby's blood. That's when the Rh factor of the mom and the baby are different. Hemophilia is a rare genetic inherited disorder where the blood is missing the clotting factor entirely, which would lead to life-threatening bleeding if they're not given the clotting factor. Hepatitis is an infection of the blood, usually from a virus, although there can be bacterial infection as well. Hepa or hepatic is always related to circulation and liver, and itis is inflammation of. Hodgkin's disease is a malignant lymph cancer. There's different kinds of hepatitis. There's A, there's B, there's C, there's D, there's E, there's non-A, non-B. Basically, with hepatitis, you get flu-like symptoms, enlarged liver, really tired, logy, sometimes a low-grade fever, and there's all different ways you can get it. You can get it from infected objects, infected food and water. You can have blood-to-blood contact with Hep B or Hep D. Somebody could have gone to the bathroom and not washed their hands, and then you have fecal contamination, or water gets contaminated from feces too. It's different ways. Some other disorders of the circulatory system: leukemia. It's a blood cancer where all of a sudden there's a huge amount of white blood cells, and they choke out the red blood cells. If your body was full of white blood cells and no red blood cells to carry the oxygen, you'd be exhausted, and it would be hard for you to stop bleeding and that kind of thing. Lymphosarcoma is a group of malignant cancers of the lymph tissue that are not Hodgkin's related. Polycythemia is an abnormal increase in the number of red blood cells. Poly meaning many, cythemia, red blood cells. You have all these red blood cells and suddenly your blood is thick like molasses. Septicemia is blood poisoning. It's an infection that occurs when strep, staph, some kind of pathogen enters the blood. Sickle cell anemia is an inherited disorder that results in, instead of this red blood cells being nice little disc shaped, they actually sickle. It doesn't give enough surface area when they sickle for the hemoglobin to bind with the oxygen, and people end up with anemia. Splenomegaly is when the spleen is enlarged because there's an infection, and it results in either mono or severe anemia. Thalassemia is one of the most common genetic disorders when the body makes an abnormal form of hemoglobin. Thrombocytopenia I talked about, when there's not enough platelets to clot the blood. A blood clot is called a thrombosis or an embolism. Two different names for that, and that's when the blood comes together and forms a clot. So those are some of the disorders. 12 minutes of circulatory system, and now we'll talk about the cardiac system.